This is my ranking of hack-and-slash games that I've played based purely on my personal experience. Each one is placed from masterpiece down to trash, depending on how satisfying the combat feels, how smooth and impactful the combos are, and how well each game keeps the action fast, fluid, and engaging. Let's get straight into the list. Final Fantasy XVI started slowly for me, but once the story opened up, I got heavily invested in Clive's journey and the political chaos surrounding Valisthea. The combat felt fast and flashy without turning into mindless button mashing, especially after unlocking more icon abilities and mixing attacks together during larger fights. I also liked how the game balanced massive cinematic battles with quieter character moments between Clive, Joshua, and Jill. Some side quests dragged the pacing down, and a few supporting characters deserved far more screen time, but the emotional scenes near the ending carried a lot of weight. The soundtrack and voice acting also added a huge amount of intensity during major moments. The darker tone made the world feel harsher and far more memorable. In my ranking, this lands in the excellent tier. Darksiders II immediately clicked with me because Death felt far more agile and aggressive than most hack-and-slash protagonists I've played. The combat had a satisfying flow once I started mixing scythes, secondary weapons, and special abilities together during larger fights. I also liked the darker fantasy atmosphere, massive environments, and the comic book-style art direction that gave every area a strong identity. At the same time, the game dragged itself down with too many fetch quests, repetitive dungeon structures, and puzzles that became frustrating instead of interesting after a while. The loot system added variety, but constantly replacing gear started feeling unnecessary near the middle of the campaign. Even with those issues, the boss fights, soundtrack, and fast combat kept me engaged through the adventure. This earns a spot in my great tier. Devil May Cry 5 delivered exactly what I want from a hack-and-slash game because every fight felt stylish, fast, and rewarding without becoming repetitive. I liked how Nero, Dante, and V all played completely differently, which kept the campaign fresh from beginning to end. Dante easily had my favorite moveset since swapping weapons and styles during combos made every battle feel chaotic in the best possible way. The combat system also had an insane amount of depth, especially when chasing higher style rankings and experimenting with advanced combos against tougher enemies and bosses. Even after finishing the story, I still wanted to replay missions just to improve fights and try new techniques. The soundtrack, animations, and over-the-top action constantly matched the energy of the gameplay. This sits right at the top in my masterpiece tier. Evil West felt like a throwback hack-and-slash game that cared more about fun combat than complicated systems, and that worked really well for me. I liked how every fight pushed me into aggressive melee attacks while constantly mixing in guns, electric abilities, flamethrowers, and brutal finishers against large groups of monsters. The combat stayed exciting because new upgrades and weapons kept unlocking throughout the campaign, giving me more ways to chain attacks together during chaotic arena battles. The dark western setting also gave the game a unique style that helped it stand apart from other action games I've played recently. At the same time, the enemy variety became repetitive near the second half, and most levels followed nearly the exact same structure from beginning to end. Even with those issues, I still place this in the great tier. Castlevania Lords of Shadow immediately felt different from older Castlevania games because it focused far more on cinematic combat and large fantasy set pieces. I liked exploring the dark environments, climbing ruined structures, solving puzzles, and fighting giant monsters across the long campaign. Gabriel's combat abilities also became more fun once the light and dark magic powers started adding healing effects and stronger attacks during battles. Some fights eventually became repetitive because many enemies were defeated using similar combos again and again. The fixed camera also created frustrating moments when enemies attacked from outside the screen. Even with those issues, the soundtrack, gothic atmosphere, and huge castle landscapes kept me interested until the ending. The adventure constantly felt large in scale and visually memorable. This easily earns a place in my great tier. Stellar Blade kept me engaged because the combat felt fast, challenging, and rewarding from the beginning all the way to the final bosses. I liked how the parry system pushed me to learn enemy attack patterns, instead of simply attacking non-stop during fights. The combat also stayed fresh, because new abilities, weapons, and upgrades kept changing how I approached stronger enemies and larger encounters. Boss fights were easily the highlight since many of them demanded quick reactions and proper timing while still looking visually impressive during every phase. I also enjoyed exploring the open areas for hidden items, outfits, and upgrades that made progression feel worthwhile. The story and characters were definitely weaker than the gameplay, and several side quests became repetitive after a while. This goes in my excellent tier. Ninja Gaiden 3 disappointed me because it moved away from the challenging combat and precise gameplay that made earlier entries feel rewarding to master. The combat still had fast movement, brutal attacks, and plenty of action, but most enemies felt too easy and repetitive during long battles. I also got tired of fighting huge groups of similar enemies inside arena after arena without much variety between encounters. The story tried focusing heavily on Ryu's emotions and darker themes, but the pacing constantly slowed down because of cutscenes and scripted moments that interrupted the action too often. Boss fights also became frustrating since several of them repeated multiple times throughout the campaign with only small differences. The combat still had occasional fun moments, especially during larger fights, but too many design problems held the game back badly. This lands in my mediocre tier ranking. Samurai Jack Battle Through Time worked best for me when it focused on fast combat and recreating memorable moments from the cartoon series. I liked seeing familiar characters, locations, and enemies because the game captured the style and atmosphere of the show surprisingly well. The combat also had decent variety thanks to different weapons, combo attacks, parries, and stronger special moves during larger battles. At the same time, many mechanics felt outdated compared to modern hack-and-slash games, especially the awkward climbing sections and repetitive enemy arenas. Progression also became frustrating because several upgrades stayed locked behind currencies that stopped appearing late into the campaign. Some fights were still fun, especially when cutting through groups of robotic enemies with Jack's sword, but the gameplay never evolved enough to stay exciting for long periods. This ends up sitting in my mediocre tier. Asura's Wrath felt more like an interactive anime series than a traditional hack-and-slash game, but the sheer spectacle kept me hooked from start to finish. I loved how every boss fight escalated into something completely ridiculous, with planet-sized enemies, massive explosions, and non-stop cinematic action during nearly every chapter. The presentation also stood out because the art style, music, and dramatic scenes constantly made the adventure feel larger than life. At the same time, the game definitely relied too heavily on cutscenes and quick-time events instead of deeper gameplay systems during many sections. The combat itself was still fun whenever the game actually let me fight enemies directly, especially during larger one-on-one battles against powerful opponents. Even with its repetitive structure and short length, the experience stayed memorable the entire way through. This easily reaches the excellent tier. Darksiders 3 felt much more difficult and methodical compared to the earlier games, especially during boss fights that punished careless attacks constantly. I liked how the combat focused more on dodging, counterattacks, and learning enemy patterns instead of simple button mashing during larger encounters. Fury's different weapons and elemental forms also added variety because each ability changed both combat and movement while exploring new areas. Some bosses became frustrating because of long runbacks after dying, and the story itself never stayed particularly memorable throughout the campaign. The world design also looked less impressive than I expected compared to other action games from the same period. The combat system stayed satisfying once I adapted to the slower pacing and tougher enemies. Exploring interconnected areas and unlocking new traversal abilities also helped progression feel rewarding enough. This lands in my good tier. Shadow Warrior 2 kept me entertained because the combat moved incredibly fast while constantly throwing huge groups of demons, robots, and monsters into chaotic battles. I liked how smoothly the game mixed melee weapons, guns, magic abilities, and movement together during fights without slowing the pace down. Switching from katanas to shotguns, rocket launchers, or chainsaws during combat always felt satisfying, especially once stronger upgrades and weapon mods started unlocking later in the campaign. The colorful environments and levels also gave the adventure more variety than I expected. Some bosses became repetitive because several fights reused the same shield mechanics repeatedly. Enemy variety also could have been better during longer sessions. Even with those issues, the fast combat, humor, and weapon customization kept me invested the entire way through. This belongs in my great tier. Valkyrie Elysium started slowly for me, but the combat became much more enjoyable once more abilities, spells, and Einherjar companions started unlocking later in the game. I liked how quickly Valkyrie could move around enemies with the soul chain mechanic, while combining melee attacks with elemental magic during larger fights. The combat also stayed satisfying because switching between divine arts and summoned allies added variety against different enemy types throughout the campaign. The biggest weakness was easily the story, since many important moments lacked emotional impact, and several environments felt too empty while exploring Midgar. Camera problems during tighter combat sections also became frustrating when enemies crowded around me near walls. Even with those issues, the combat system stayed fun enough to keep me pushing through the adventure until the ending. This settles into my good tier. Dante's Inferno kept me interested because the journey through the different circles of hell constantly showed disturbing enemies, brutal environments, and massive boss encounters. I liked how every area had its own identity, especially the darker designs inspired by punishment, greed, and suffering throughout the campaign. The combat clearly borrowed ideas from other hack-and-slash games, but mixing scythe attacks, ranged cross abilities, and magic powers still felt satisfying during larger battles. I also enjoyed upgrading holy and unholy abilities because it added some variety to progression while unlocking stronger attacks later in the game. The biggest issue was that many fights became too easy since simple attacks worked against most enemies without needing advanced combos. Even with that weakness, the atmosphere, presentation, and brutal action, this settles into my good tier. Soulstice had a rough start for me, but the combat became much more satisfying once more weapons, combos, and abilities started unlocking later in the campaign. I liked switching between different weapons during fights because each one worked better against certain enemy types and kept combat from becoming too repetitive. The enemy designs also stood out since many monsters looked strange, aggressive, and memorable compared to the bland environments surrounding them. Managing Briar's attacks together with Lute's defensive abilities created a decent amount of challenge during larger battles, especially when stronger enemies started appearing in mixed groups. The biggest problems were the frustrating camera and the repetitive level design that constantly slowed down progression between combat encounters. Some fights also felt unfair when too many effects filled the screen at once. This settles into my good tier. Prince of Persia. The Forgotten Sands became far more enjoyable for me once the platforming challenges started combining multiple powers together during longer sequences. I liked running across walls, freezing water into climbable paths, and chaining movement abilities together while navigating massive environments filled with traps and collapsing structures. The rewind mechanic also helped difficult sections feel fair because mistakes never became too frustrating during complicated platforming moments. Combat started weak in the opening hours, since most fights felt repetitive and simple, but later abilities and larger enemy groups added more variety once stronger powers unlocked. I also enjoyed mixing magical attacks with regular sword combos during battles against huge waves of enemies. The story never stayed memorable, and the visuals looked inconsistent throughout the adventure. This earns a strong place in my great tier. NieR Automata constantly surprised me because the gameplay kept changing styles while still keeping the combat smooth and exciting the entire time. I loved switching between fast hack and slash combat, shooting sections, platforming, and even strange story moments that completely changed the pace of the adventure. The combat itself felt amazing because attacks flowed together so naturally while dodging enemies and chaining weapons during chaotic battles. I also liked exploring the ruined futuristic world, since every location had a lonely atmosphere supported by an incredible soundtrack that stayed memorable long after finishing the game. Some story moments became confusing, especially during later endings, and a few side quests dragged the pacing down at times. Even with those issues, the emotional themes, combat variety, music, and unforgettable presentation easily place this in my masterpiece tier. That's my ranking of the hack and slash games I've played so far, based on which ones kept the combat exciting, rewarding, and fun from beginning to end. Let me know which games would make your own masterpiece tier and which hack and slash titles I should play next.